Okay, looks like we are on, and it looks like the power is actually stable this week, so we don't have to worry about that. Hi, I'm back, and here we are, third book called A Bright Symmetry. I want to, excuse me. A Bright Symmetry is a series of stories set over the course of the year, telling the story of the two main characters, Scott Madigan and Zoe Baird. Uh, Starts off with a archaeological expedition that goes very bad. And I wanted to do something different with A Bright Symmetry. Rather than tell the story as the traditional novel using traditional chapters, I decided to use a series of stories to cover the this 1 year in the life of Scott Madigan. And when I wrote the first story that I had written was A God to Dance With. I wrote it as a freestanding story. I never thought about writing anything before or after it. I knew Scott's immortal, so I knew he'd be popping up in other places, probably under other names. But I didn't think of anything beyond that. Excuse me. The elixir of life. The last time I sent out A God to Dance With to a traditional magazine, the rejection letter mentioned that the story seemed to that editor that it was part of something bigger. And at that point, I started thinking, maybe there is more to this. And I started then putting together stories, what might happen after A God to Dance With. Originally, there was supposed to be 12 stories and covering a longer period of time than 1 year. But I thought that was going to be getting a bit too big and unwieldy, so I pared it down to the 7 stories that it's at now, and 1 year of time. So the 7 stories in A Bright Symmetry are, to begin with, Only Time, which is a short little introductory piece, quasi prologue. In it, Scott and Zoe travel back to Earth to visit Scott's old, emphasis on old, friends, Brenna Alexander and her husband, George Severin. And while they reminisce, Zoe thinks she hears someone saying goodbye to her, but can't see who it is. This was not actually the first piece that I wrote for the collection. The first piece was A God to Dance With, as I said. This was actually, I think, one of the last pieces. Hi, Kaz. This was actually one of the last pieces to be written, and actually forced me to think about something. I had to actually think about how did Scott become immortal, because I had never addressed that. People asked me, and I said, it was a duel, but I never went into any specifics. So in Only Time, I did. I also set up the circular nature of it at the end by having Zoe hear somebody say goodbye to her, and then have two people having a discussion about Scott and Zoe, and then disappearing. Ooh. This is also the first chronological appearance of Scott's old friends, George and Brenna. Brenna is a vampire, and George is immortal, and literally Scott's oldest friend. They do have their own novel titled Under the Dark of the Moon that I will get to one day. The second story is a god to dance with, and this is the one that kicked it all off. Scott and Zoe are on an archaeological expedition to the planet Stelvra, where they're investigating the myth of Keiral Tan, who the Stelvrans refer to as the sleeping god. They're hoping to conduct research before the planet's unstable political system collapses, but there's something waiting for them down in the tomb. And with this one, I actually wrote this story twice. For those who know me, I'm not a fast writer. I write very slowly. And what I did first, I wrote this story, I wrote the first draft of it in 30 days, which is the fastest I've ever written a story, while listening to Mussorgsky's pictures at an exhibition over and over and over again. It just seemed to fit. But I thought in the initial version of the story that I was telegraphing what was going to happen at the end too much, so I rewrote it a little bit. It's plot line's essentially the same, but I removed a few things that I thought gave the ending away. I also for this invented the Dolwa, the energy beings, and set them up as observers. They watch, but the only time they interact is when they bond with a physical body, a dead physical body, because they can't inhabit a body that's already inhabited by a spirit. And I had to figure out what they can do, but which then says, why did this Dolwa help the Stelvrans? Well, they were dying. They were on the verge of extinction, so this Dolwa in a rather altruistic way used its knowledge to help them. It did nothing. She did nothing herself to system. She just said, "Okay, this is how you do it. Now go do it." And then, starting to feel weak, she returned to this cavern, and waited for Zoe. And at the end of it, yes, this is a spoiler, so bear with me. At the end, Zoe is stabbed, and the doll wakes up, merges with Zoe's body, and then proceeds forward from there, taking Zoe's place with Scott. The third story, which is called Being, which you could refer to as The Day After, because it literally starts the next morning. Scott begins to come to terms with the aftermath of the events in the tomb while getting to know the person Zoe has become, and the suspicions of the ship's captain, the ship that brought them to Stelvra, weren't helping him cope. When a systems failure threatens then a systems failure threatens the whole ship, and there's only one person on board that can help him. Yes, I know, it's a bit contrived. But this gives a little bit background into Zoe, the Dolwa. It goes into some more detail of why she did it. She's different from other Dolwa. Dolwa don't normally interfere or do anything but observe. They don't generally help the races that they're observing. But Zoe wanted to. She felt she had to. And so she did. That's why she helped them. That's why she helps the crew of the starship. She repairs damage to their reactors so that they're not floating through space waiting for help to arrive. It's also the first introduction that something is not quite right with Zoe, because as she's starting to perform the repairs, her hands are starting to shake, which is not supposed to happen. In the third story, which takes place about 6 months later, which is called Intermezzo. Excuse me. Oh, the life of a caffeine addict. Zoe's condition has been deteriorating, and she doesn't know why. To help find a cure, Scott has to turn to the science directorate once again to set up an expedition to a distant sector, one that's believed to be uninhabited. Zoe's people are energy forms. If they don't want you to see them, they are not going to be seen. And so the sector of the galaxy that she says she comes from, as far as the government knows, there's nothing there. Sorry, just getting my thoughts together here. Also harkens back a bit to a story from Campfire Stories, The End of Seconds, where she references Aricia Mastani, the main character from The End of Seconds and the last survivor of the previous universe. Excuse me again. I forgot to mention that also Aricia is mentioned in Being. Before Zoe goes in to start repairs, Scott asks her, "Can you do this?" She says, "Of course I can." He says, "I hope to God you do." And Zoe says, "Do you know who God is?" And Scott says, "Do you?" "Hi, Nancy." And Scott says, "Do you know who God is?" And Zoe says, "Yes." Zoe is Scott is tongue tied again. God is Aricia Mastani, last survivor of the universe previous to this one, but that's not important right now. She kind of waves it off, so she can get on with the repairs. I harken back to that in Intermezzo, where Scott asks her again about Aricia, and says, "Okay, Aricia is a myth. We don't believe. Most people don't. Most Dolwa don't believe in it. They think the race was created when a supermassive star went hypernova, and they were created that way. Or are they?" The third story is the longest of the collections, called The Ark of Heaven, and introduces another immortal, another of Scott's old friends, Arcadia Ryan. Scott contacts Arcadia Ryan, an old friend and independent starship master, to transport him, Zoe, and a team of scientists and politicians to Zoe's home to try and find out what's wrong with her, as well as study her people and establish relations with them. But Scott hadn't counted on the science directorate having its own agenda. This one expanding the world a little bit more, showing that the science directorate will do anything to learn about something new, right up to and including backstabbing. They're also paranoid. They're the ones who should be looking forward. Yes, we have to learn about the unknown, but they're the ones who say, "Okay, it's unknown. It's going to kill us. We have to stop it." And Scott's the exact opposite. Scott and the ambassador who goes are the exact opposite. They're saying, "Okay, this is new. We have to learn about it. Let's get to know it. Let's find out what it's about." And the story also goes into some background on a little bit of Scott's past. He found Arcadia right after she became immortal, and back in '96, I believe it was. And there's also the first of what I call a WTF moment, or as I refer to them in public, a what the frau moment. It's a moment where a character does or says something that makes you go, "The frau?" There's a conversation between the two science directorate representatives, and the head of the expedition is saying, we might have to have a second expedition to come back with a larger science team. And Lane Danforth, the other one, the second one, Okay, do we still have a connection? Kaz, Nancy, are you still hearing this? All right, let's okay. Kaz, Nancy, are you still hearing this? All right, I'm just going to keep going. It looks like we're still connected, but I'm not certain. So we'll see what happens. Um, okay, I was talking about the what the frau moment. There's where the head of the expedition says they may need a second expedition, and Danforth says, "No, we're not going to need an expedition." And all of a sudden, the head of the expedition changes his mind and says, "Last week it was the power blinking. This week it's the Wi-Fi connection going in and out." Hang on a second. It's not my modem. I've got lights on my modem. Joy. Okay, so um, okay, so we're going to. I'm going to continue. I don't know if anything I just said has gone out. So let's see what happens. The It turns out that the science directorate um, doesn't just want to study them for purposes of learning about the Dolwa. The science directorate wants to study them so they can come up with a way of uh, defeating them, because the head of the expedition is convinced that that the Dolwa cannot be trusted, and so they are trying to figure that out. And the Dolwa don't like that, so they begin to strike back. And in the course of trying to take the ship back over from the science directorate, the um, we also find out that the Dolwa can travel through time, and that the first time they tried to take the ship back, they failed catastrophically, and everybody was killed except Zoe. It ends with Zoe being exiled from from her people, not because of the life she took back on Stelvra, but because of the time travel. That is one thing they cannot do. Next story is called Circle, and they're traveling back. They've dropped the rest of the party back off at their origin point, and they're traveling to Earth now. Scott, Zoe, Arcadia, and her crew to visit Scott and to visit George and Brenda, excuse me, so that they can let them know what happened to Zoe. Arcadia brings Scott and Zoe back to Earth so they can tell Brenda and George what happened to Zoe. After misunderstandings, Scott finally finds out who said goodbye to Zoe on their last visit to Earth a year ago. This is technically the end of the circle. I'm Vampires, as I said, Brenna is a vampire, and seeing as vampires have extremely fine senses, she knows immediately that Zoe is not human, and starts to perceive her as a threat. And then Zoe changes something within herself, and now um, Brenna is sensing her as an immortal. It also turns out that from the present of Circle, Zoe and Scott travel back in time 1 year, and it's Scott who is rendered invisible by Zoe, who goes in and talks and says goodbye to the original Zoe. That's why that's the circle. Excuse me, my allergies are acting up a little bit. And then the final story, the period on the sentence, if you will, is called "And Forever." Zoe learns one last secret as the final circle comes to a close. It starts off with her hovering over the surface of the sun, absorbing solar energy directly from the sun, and sensing the entire what's going on across the entire solar system. And Danforth, who turns out to be one of the elders of the Dolwa, shows up, and they talk, and Zoe begins to sense that there is something more to Danforth, and she reasons out that Danforth is actually Aricia Mastani, the last survivor of the previous universe. And we learn a little bit about the history of the Dolwa. Why do the Dolwa observe but never interact? And why is it illegal amongst the Dolwa for them to travel back through time? And why were the Dolwa created in the first place? Aricia created one race and one race only, and that was the Dolwa. And there are Dolwa in every galaxy in the universe. They are her eyes and ears. Her mandate at the end of seconds was to make sure that this universe continues on, that the same errors that led to, I suppose error is actually not the right word, the same course of action, if you will, that led to the destruction of the previous universe not happen in this one. That's why the Dolwa can't travel back in time. She's afraid that somebody will travel back in time and the whole course of events will start over again, and this universe will end up being destroyed. It's kind of goes with my own personal religious views. I've always thought, what if God initiated the Big Bang? So that's it. That's the end of seconds. I'm not sure if anybody heard the back half of this after my Wi-Fi signal blinked a couple of times. A Bright Symmetry is available through Smashwords for ebooks, Kindle for Amazon and print on demand, iTunes, Nook, Lulu, and also through CreateSpace for print on demand. It's $4.99 for the ebook, $6.99 for the print on demand. I'm sorry if this was a little clunky. I don't know what was going on with the Wi-Fi signal today. So that's it. Thanks for listening. Thanks, Kaz. Thanks, Nancy, and anybody else who might have been who is listening to this later on or on YouTube. And it will be available on YouTube later today. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and I'll see you in 2 weeks where we get to talk about the first of the novelettes, The Fault Lies Not. See you then. Bye.